maybe we can kind of get rolling. I think people will kind of continue to filter in here, but we are so lucky, and I'm so happy to be here with Noelle Flowers, and she's gonna be giving a presentation today. So I'm gonna let her kind of take the wheel and share some slides. At the end, it sounds like maybe the last 15, 20 minutes we'll have time for Q&A. If you want to drop anything into the Q&A, during the chat, just so you can save the question. I think that's a good idea as well. And I think that's about it. Anything else you want to share before we kind of kick it off?
No, I don't think so. I'm happy to see everybody here, and we can kind of just dive right in. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and you guys should still be able to see my tiny little face in the corner as well.
I think so.
So,
hey, Nelson.
Grab the right window here. I keep seeing tweets of people saying, let's just stop saying I'm going to share my screen. We all know.
You're supposed to say screen share commencing.
That's right. That's great. Okay. So, I gave you a little preview of the end. So today I'm going to be talking about a very broad topic, but how to launch an online community. And I'm going to be talking about this through a specific 5-step framework that I've kind of honed in on, having worked in a big software company and launching a community for like a larger brand, but also being in a position of working with a lot of like smaller creators or independent entrepreneurs that have small teams. And that's led me to do a lot of thinking about, if I were a independent entrepreneur, what kind of steps of this process for a big company would I use, and what things would I scrap? So what are kind of the unskippable components of a community launch? I have sometimes referred to this as sort of like a lean community launch, but I know that for developers, that kind of like lean agile framework means something very specific. So I don't want to kind of grab that language too much. But yeah, this is me. I have a friend who said that in this picture, I look like I'm going to steal your lunch money, but I promise I will not. I am a former high school music teacher, and then I became a community manager. I work at Teachable. Some of you may be familiar. And I manage Teachable's big members only community program, which is also hosted on Circle. But I also managed our migration off of Facebook groups, which is where we started off. So I'm also happy to speak to anything in the migration process, because that definitely informs a lot of how I think about community. And I'll also just say, I have this teacher background, so I have a little bit of a teacher voice, which some people like, but I promise I'm not going to send you to the principal's office. So bear with me here. So today we're going to cover kind of like a why, or a bigger picture of community. This is a big moment for community. 2020 is kind of like an enormous year. I've been calling it like community's biggest year yet. And so I think it's important to kind of zoom out and look back into, what is the purpose of this? Why are we using this, other than just kind of like we're having a moment or it's a buzzword? I also want to bring you into sort of like a bigger vision for community. As we're having this big moment for everybody's talking about community, it has this large relevance in the marketing world and in the entrepreneurial world. I think that a lot of people are starting to employ communities. It's getting like more competitive. And I think the ones that are going to rise to the front of the pack are going to have a bit of an innovative view towards what community is and what it can be. And then the real meat of it is I'm going to share this 5-step framework that you can use to launch a community, what I've called the right way. And what I really mean here is just avoiding what I call like community debt, which, as people that use no code and build products, you know that there's this concept of technical debt, where you kind of plow forward and try to hack things together, and like later on you get in trouble. And the same thing can happen with community if you set things up without a really strong strategy. So that's what I want to help you avoid, but in a really lightweight way. And I should also say, if anyone at any point wants to pop questions into the chat, you can absolutely do so. I'm happy to pause throughout the presentation and grab questions, and we'll also be leaving a good chunk at the end to talk through things. So I want to talk about what I really mean when I say community for the purpose of this presentation. This is a concept that's really important to me, but community isn't just another word for audience. It's not just another way to refer to everyone who's looking at you. when I think about audience, I might think about, social media, email list, even like people that you've spoken to in a webinar or anybody who's kind of been in front of your message. But when I talk about community in this presentation, I'm really talking about like a special curated place or even like a program that you create for your most engaged members. And that doesn't mean that we have to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's okay that community has a broader context. Obviously, we all have our own, community. Like I live in Brooklyn, so I have my local community. We have maybe communities of friends, or we maybe even see our audience members as part of our community, and that's totally okay. But I think it's important to put a little bit of distinction between just like audience building in general and putting together a really strong community program. And yeah, I've acknowledged this a little bit, but I always like to just say community is having a really big moment. I think a really good piece of evidence for this is ComSoar's community ecosystem map, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in this presentation. But this is from Mac Redden's Twitter, and some of you may know him. He's speaking in this program as well. But they keep this list of all of the tools and softwares that support the community ecosystem, from things like actual community platforms like Circle to things like engagement tools like Donut, or things that you can plug into Slack. And he talks about how there's 43 that are less than a year old. And that to me says a lot. If so many people are investing in developing and resourcing softwares to support this world, this really tells me that this is something that is exploding right now in sort of like the entrepreneurial space. So yeah, I always like to pause here and just ask people to type into the chat, and maybe David, you can read out some of the responses. Just give me like a quick description of why you're here. Like, what is the community that you're looking to start? Is there a business that it complements, or is the community the business in itself?
Yeah, and I just linked up that ComSoar post as well for people who want to check that out. But yeah, I think that's a great question. Are people looking to go community direct? Is it that you have a business and you want to, tack on the community to that to sort of support the product and your development? What type of business are you looking at?
This always helps me too, because as a former teacher, I like to give a lot of examples, and you'll see me sort of searching for metaphors as I talk through this. And sometimes it's nice to be able to link those up to specific examples that you guys give me about what you're building.
Light says, I work in open source communities, which that's interesting. It's a different style for sure.
That's awesome.
Community that helps Tessa says, a community that helps young athletes and their parents navigate the college athletic recruiting process. Looking for this to be a big part of our platform, Recruit HQ.
Yeah, and Tessa, I think we had connected in MakerPad as well, so very cool.
Nice. Alex says, we produce content and courses for developers and are looking to build a strong community around that. Nelson says, I'm building a community to help people learn Webflow.
Awesome. So these are quite in my wheelhouse. As I mentioned, I probably should have given some context about what Teachable is. I just assumed that people know, but Teachable is an online course creation platform. So all of the folks in the community that I manage have sort of content-based businesses that are about education. So a lot of the communities that I see folks starting are sort of like plugged into an educational business. Somebody mentioned they have courses.
Yeah, Nick just also said, we recently launched a community for leaders around podcast/newsletter/content, an offshoot side hustle of our marketing company. So once again, content production in the wheelhouse.
That's awesome. I love that. I might have a connect for you. I know somebody else who has a kind of podcast business as well. Okay, so I want to talk through some of the benefits to starting an online community, and I'll just kind of get this out of the way. Relationships are obviously a huge benefit of starting a community. I think that's the thing that draws most of us to it. We want to have this deeper sense of connection with members of our audience. We want to learn from them. We want to have a genuine relationship with them. But because I think this is such an intuitive element of community building, and kind of the part that doesn't need to be taught, I'm not going to harp on it too much. I'm going to talk instead about some of the more kind of strategic and tactical pillars of community building that I've learned about further on in my career that I think are a bit harder to see. So one that I think is really important is retention and success. And I put here even between launches, and this could apply to online courses, but I think it really applies to, you could sub out the word launches for like big promotions. But I think a lot of businesses run on this sort of like, you're getting a few customers, and then you have this big bump that comes from a big promotional effort, or you've launched a new product, or you've put out a new course, or even for content businesses, sometimes it's like, I publish a blog post every 2 weeks, and that's how I get my members. I publish another one. And I think community is a really good, strong way to retain customers in between those big pushes. It's something that kind of can live on underneath your business as you're putting out new products, and that can help people succeed towards the objective that kind of led them to you as a business, in between those moments. So I really like to look at community as a retention tool and a way to help people reach success in between those moments. I also really love seeing community as an experimental content pipeline. I think a lot of people see communities as like, oh, there's chatter happening. It's happening today, it's happening tomorrow, but maybe next week I forget what happened in the community last week. I think it's really important to see the types of things that are happening in your community as like a source of content. And if you're a business owner, you know how much content pipeline can become like a real monkey on your back. Like you need to produce something for social media, or you need a topic for your next blog. And community is a great source for this kind of stuff to help you identify the people that can beef up your content strategy. And then on the flip side, it's also a great place to experiment with new ideas first with people that are really engaged. So perhaps you already have some really like traditional content channels that you're running that are working well, but you're thinking, oh, I want to do like a challenge or something like that with my members. Community is a great place to test that kind of product. And the last thing is, I think there's already a demand for community for many, many businesses. And this is evident if you even just go on Facebook. Sorry for suggesting it, but if you were to go on Facebook and just like type in the name of your niche and search for groups, there's a high likelihood you're going to find some existing communities that aren't being run with any strategy or purpose, but that are people just like hungry to meet other people that have a similar interest. And so I think it's a real opportunity for businesses who have the resources to like create an amazing experience to carve out that share of voice by owning that community space and associating themselves with that thing. And I always chuckle at this slide because I've left myself like a little bachelor/bachelorette joke here. If anybody watches that you know, they talk about like being in it for the wrong reasons a lot. But there's a few things that come up like quite a lot that I hear from creators as like, oh, I want to start a community for these reasons, where I'm always like, don't do it, it's so much work. So I always like to leave like a little word of caution here. Communities tend to not be a great choice for adding bonus content to a business or for like super top of funnel acquisition content, just because they're a ton of work. It takes a lot of work to get people together. It's a really kind of, to me, a high touch program, something that you do for your most engaged members and people that you want to retain. And so I always caution people from using this as a way to like rope people in off the bat. And there's a lot of room for nuance in this. There are some people that do an incredible job doing sort of like community qualified leads and using this earlier on in their funnel, but I think it's a very specialized use case. And typically I like it better as a retention tool. I also always like to encourage brands that want to grow a lot from using community to fill kind of like plug holes in their business. So a good example of this is like setting up a community as a support forum if you know down the line you will have a support team. And the reason for that is it's really hard once you set up a culture in a community to pivot it later on to a more kind of like high value, genuine use case if you've already said, oh, I'm using this space to let people report bugs. So think about what the ideal scenario is for like supporting or having bug reports or product ideation or whatever it is you want to talk to people about, and really gut check whether it's a good fit for community or whether there's another process that you want to pursue. And I just always love bringing up this term community washing. Somebody mentioned this on Twitter. I thought it was amazing. Just this idea of kind of going, oh, community is this amazing concept that's so buzzy right now, and I want to kind of like put the label community on stuff. So just want to make sure that we're kind of in it for the right reasons, to quote The Bachelor. Now that I've talked you off a ledge, are you ready? I hope so. And if not, hopefully this presentation can help you kind of check off some of these boxes if you're like, I'm not sure if I'm ready. But I think if you have all three of these things, you're really poised to start a community. You have an audience that loves your work already. So they're trying to get something done. You know that they have shared experiences because of the contacts that you have with them. You know these people would like to interact with each other. They would get something out of talking to each other and learning from each other. And they're going through it alone right now. You may also be looking to kind of centralize your experience, whether it's for content or having people gather together. Maybe you have a ton of different really high touch content programs and you want to have them live under one roof. Community is a great way to do that. It tends to give you kind of like a home base for discussion, and then you can plug in different programs like exclusive content or networking events or webinars like this into that. MakerPad does a great job of this. And yeah, you got the time. And this is the one I really hope to free up for you with this framework. Launching a community is like a new product, and it's something that needs to be nurtured, but hopefully I can kind of steer you in the direction of like separating the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, with the important steps to launch it. So yeah, go ahead and type into the chat if you feel like you're ready to go, or if you're like, I'm very frightened of starting a community, or you feel like you have blockers that are keeping you from it. And David, feel free to tell me if you see stuff popping up.
Sure, I added that I'm ready, so.
I'm ready. Woo. Yeah, and I also want to bring you into this promised bolder approach for community. And these are just a few things that I think if you can adopt some of these mindsets, you can kind of jump to the head of the pack. There's going to be a lot of communities coming out in the next couple of years. This is super, super popular strategy right now. And I think the communities that embody these values are going to kind of rise above the rest. So one of them is this idea of like transcending the forum. So don't think of community just as like, I'm creating a place for people to chat with each other. Although likely people will chat, they'll make friendships, they'll have discussions, but some of the ideas that drive it, or the programs that you might want to plug in may go beyond just a virtual discussion. So ideally, you have some other things that you want to run there as well, whether that's webinars like MakerPad is doing, challenges, programs, networking connects, some other things that people can draw from your community experience. I'm also super passionate about this idea of going beyond engagement for engagement's sake. It's really scary as a community builder to launch a space and sort of fear that people aren't really going to talk here, or you can get this sense like if it's not super active and constantly buzzing, then it's a total flop. But I think it's important to kind of connect back to your purpose and think about what you really want to see happening there. So if there's a lower volume of engagement, but the engagement's really good and people are making really strong connections, they're making partnerships, they're being able to be featured on your blog, those kinds of things are really valuable outcomes, whereas a lot of chatter might not lead anywhere, even though it feels kind of satisfying. Yeah, and then these last two go hand in hand, but giving your best members a place of status, letting them kind of float above. So whether that's like giving them a chance to own a portion of the community program, giving them a chance to speak to the community, practice their public speaking or webinars, giving them a place in your blog, and giving the best content a new life. So making sure that if somebody's sharing like an absolute pure gold strategy in your community, it doesn't just like stay in the community. away from people's eyes, you put it onto a pedestal in your content strategy as well. And these are some sample use cases that I've seen from folks, and maybe you can type into the chat as I talk which one of these things kind of fits with what you'd like to do with a community. But I see folks using community as like a place of shared practice, and this tends to work really well for very kind of like skill building type of businesses. So if you're teaching people how to build an email list, or I know somebody who teaches people to play blues harmonica, and he has a community that is all about kind of like workshopping the pieces that he gives them and having them give feedback to each other. I've also seen folks like Pat Flynn at Smart Passive Income uses this second use case of kind of like top tier access. Billy Bross is another example of this, but if the business kind of centers around the creator or the consultant as like a big figure, communities are a good way to give a sort of inner circle of people access to that person, whether that's through like a mastermind or a weekly Q&A, things like that. And then lastly, and this is one of my favorite use cases and probably pretty aligned to what MakerPad does, but like a real-time workspace that syncs up with educational experiences like working through a course, a project, or a challenge together in real time and getting feedback. Any questions on anything I've shared so far before we go into the framework?
I have some questions for the end, but I'll save it for them.
Cool, great. Awesome. So if there is a slide to screenshot throughout this, it would be this one. This is sort of the overview of the 5-step framework that I'm going to be sharing. I'm also going to give you guys a template that you can duplicate, a Google Doc that goes through all of these in quite a lot of detail that you can fill in if you decide you want to use this strategy.
By the way, Nelson did comment and he says, no questions for me, but thank you for the knowledge. My mind is going crazy with ideas. So
amazing.
I'm also writing down some notes for myself too. So likewise, Nelson.
That's awesome to hear. Yeah, so the first step of this framework is really about setting goals. And it always feels a little silly for me to start by saying set a goal, but I really can't tell you how many community managers I've talked to who don't set goals for their community. And Richard Millington, who runs Feverbee, just sent out a newsletter that spoke to this as well, where he showed that like 80% of community managers have no community strategy at all. So even just taking the time to set out like what are the goals that I have for this space can be like really transformational in terms of the outcomes that you have with a community. And setting goals with community is a bit of a different process than other types of goal setting that you might have. And one of the key ways is that community goals should really describe two things: the impact for the members and the impact for the business. And they should always feel connected. So when you're setting out a goal, it should be both like, what do I want to actually see happen in the community? So whether that's like people are posting X amount of times, or like people are making connections with other people in the community, whatever like the real life in practice outcome is, and then make a hypothesis to like, how is that going to impact my business, or like, why is that good? So having that connection there. And so a good example is like, most communities are going to have a goal for retention. So you might say like, if people are opening up my community once a week or once a day, then they're going to stick with my product for longer. And you should really be trying to tie these things back to business goals that you already track. So in the case of Teachable, like we obviously already track things like churn. So are people stopping being customers? So that's something that I might hypothesize that I can impact with the community, and I might identify some outcomes in the community that feed into that. I'm also a big fan in community of setting anti-goals, and this doesn't mean like things that you absolutely do not want to happen. So it's not saying like, I don't want people to be mean in the community. It's saying things that you're not explicitly going to try to impact. So an example of an anti-goal for my community was, I'm not using this community as a support channel. That doesn't mean it's bad if people get support from the community. That just means that's not something I'm optimizing for. And the reason it's important to do this for community in particular is because this is such a broad concept, making relationships with other people, making a place where people talk with one another and having kind of like social experiences together. It's important to get like really specific about what are some of the real outcomes that I will optimize for specifically. And I already spoke about this concept of stopgap goals, so plugging holes in your business that you want to address with something more codified later. Okay, so that's step one. Step two is validating your instincts. So when you set goals, you already outlined kind of what you want this to look like in practice. Now you have to make sure that you were right with some of the members that you intend to have in your community. And I should say, this whole process comes from probably 6 month to a year project that I did with Teachable, migrating our community off of Facebook and into Circle. And in my process, I did a ton of different things to try to validate the process or like the project that I had. I set a ton of different goals. I went through probably, of the 5 steps I gave you, there was like 1A, 1B, 1C of all these steps. And so I'm really trying to pull out the ones that I think mattered the most for me. So if you were going to go through this process as quickly as possible, this is the stuff that I think is important not to skip. So I think user interviews is the most valuable way that you can validate your product because it kind of does double duty for you. It lets you also build some relationships that you can rely on as you launch your community. And I think 5 to 10 is perfectly fine. So getting on the phone with a few people that you think might be members and trying to vary who you interview with how engaged they are and the types of things that they're interested in. And as you try to speak to them, ask them things like, what are you interested in? What communities do you already take part in? And I like to get really broad with this. Like I'll say, you know, are you part of a library reading group? Do you kind of go to the ice rink? Like what brings you back to a social space? What role does this fill in your life? And what can my community do to be your go-to space? Like how is this going to solve problems for you? And then I also just popcorn off of them all of my kind of pie in the sky ideas. So I'll go, what if we offered a one-on-one networking connect once a month? What if we brought experts in to give webinars in the community? What if we ran challenges? And then I just asked them to gut check how interesting those programs are to them. And this taught me something really valuable when I did it for Teachable. I thought that my members really wanted to have in-person events. And this process taught me that they didn't. They were not interested at all in in-person events. This also helped me validate how I would break down my community. I thought that they would want to speak to other people in a similar business niche as them, and they did not. They wanted to speak to other people in a similar business phase. So this was really helpful for me to make the right decisions for my community. Yeah, so those are steps 1 and 2. Step 3 is setting a content cadence, and I say with a showstopper, and I'll talk more about what that means. But I believe that for a community, sort of a minimum required cadence is reliable, anticipated prompts for discussion. And that could come from you or it could come from community members. But the idea that this hinges on is people need to know, especially in a new community, that when they open it up, there's something for them to do. And a good way to do that is by using kind of like recurring prompts or things that you maybe ritualize and that you always do on Monday. So for example, in my community, I do a goal setting exercise every single Monday. And I do like a Friday wrap up. And I also do posts in between. It doesn't need to be every single day, but I think a lot of community managers do it every single day. I do. But it just needs to be on a cadence that people can come to rely on and come to trust you for. But then when I say showstopper, I'm talking about like beyond a forum. Remember I talked about like, let's transcend this idea of a forum. So think about the types of content and events that you might be able to plug into your community program that makes it just better than a place to chat. And I've listed some examples of this, but what I've found from talking to a lot of community builders is that you guys can probably also brainstorm like 25 amazing ideas for content types. And I think that this is really important because this is the reason that people open the community. They may stay and chat or they may stay and build relationships, but it tends to be a pretty big ask for someone to set up a new account on something if there's like nothing for them to get out of it. So the sky is really the limit with these types of pieces of content, but you need to have something that's really like big and flashy that you can rely on to drive people to open up the community for the first time. Yeah. And then choosing a platform. This is something that I've chatted a little bit with folks in the MakerPad community about, but I always like to say there's no objective right platform out there, but there's usually a platform that is the best fit for you based on what's available. I always like to start with outlining the key features that support my vision, and then I will kind of mark them must have, nice to have, and sometimes like okay if it's a third-party tool. So a mistake I see a lot of people making choosing platforms is like discounting something based on a feature that you could easily integrate from something else. So like for me, I knew I wanted to have live video events in my community, but it's not that important that my community have a live video feature because Zoom exists. And I'll also share, again, ComSour's community map is a really good place to get started with choosing a platform or choosing kind of like a stack of tools to support your community. They have it broken down into category. I actually think they've updated it since I put this on this slide like 2 weeks ago. It's constantly growing. And this is also linked in the template that I'm going to share with you guys as well. Yeah. And then after you've done those 4 things, the last step that really goes on forever is activating members. And I know David has spoken already, but he has this idea of activating members 10 at a time or in really small groups and relying on personal relationships first. So really starting with trying to build that one-on-one feeling where you actually know the members of your community before you start to scale. This is super counterintuitive to people who build products because we have this idea of like prioritizing things that scale well, and you kind of have to curb that instinct a bit with community and just trust that it will scale better if you start small. And I think that it was you, David, that told me you like to bring people in that have more expertise than the one before, which I also thought was incredibly genius. And then I also like to say, don't be afraid to seed conversations. So I think we have this idea that if you're trying to like start fires in different places, then it's fake. But I think it's important to remember that things don't happen totally organically. A lot of times when it feels like something's happening organically, it's because there's someone there who has really strong skills, really strong social skills, and who's great at bringing people into the fold. And as a community manager or somebody that's building a community, you want to try to be that person who's great at bringing people in and making them feel comfortable. And it's okay to play that role strategically. It'll feel like magic because the strategy is hidden. So yeah, those are the 5 steps that I would not skip. And these are a few ways that you can keep in touch with me. And I also have this framework that you can download that kind of goes through this whole template and lets you fill in. It's a Google Doc, you can copy it and fill it in. But yeah, I think we can go into Q&A.
Amazing. I'm also just pulling that up so I can link it in the chat for people who want to grab it. I think that is it. You probably still have to paste that because I think I didn't have the www. Amazing. I love that there's a framework for people to follow because I think It is really easy to miss steps, like you're saying. And I think I would totally agree. The goal aspect is like so obvious, but yet so frequently, I think, overlooked. And then what happens is if you don't set a goal, you might find yourself, or I know in my experience, you might find yourself kind of in the weeds, like you're in the thick of building the community, and you kind of get a little bit lost as to understanding, am I actually making progress? Like, and I think that's what I love about what you said around the idea of like kind of the anti-goal is, you know, you might start getting worried or like, you know, you're personally a little bit anxious about a certain thing, but it doesn't even align with your goals. So it's like, you know,
Totally.
I
Yeah.
shouldn't even be spending my time on this. So I think to have the time to do things that don't scale, you know, like you're saying, you kind of need to cut out time elsewhere on things that aren't really that important. I definitely have a few questions. If anyone else wants to add questions into the chat, feel free. It sounds like people are probably just ready to race forward on ideas they have for doing things, which is great. I know that feeling as well. I had a few, yeah, a bunch of questions that I can throw in. But for anyone else, this is your opportunity to ask a question directly. So highly recommend that. One question I had is a little specific was, I was trying to picture what the showstopper kind of event idea is, or the showstopper content. And to me, I couldn't really picture what that was. I want to have one. Is there any examples of that showstopper idea that, um, you know, and maybe this is a British baking show reference, but is there an example of that idea that you can give people from some communities you've seen before or something you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a community that I really love that I like to point to is the community chat Slack group that is run by ComSor. And Mac Redden, who runs ComSor, is talking on this as well. You guys did a great job programming this. Um,
Nice to do
but
that.
so they are a really great place to look for this kind of beyond a forum idea of community building. They have a landing page or like a website for their community. I think it's communityclub.com. Um, and you'll see when you get there that they have all of these features that kind of come along with community membership. Like they have a content library, they have a mentorship program where you can get matched up with other people. And they do all of these like really fun surprise and delight things throughout the year as well. But the idea here is really that when you're telling people, hey, come join my community, you're not just saying like, this is your go-to place to talk about X. You're also saying, I'm going to be bringing you in exclusive stuff to the community. And I think the showstopper is really about choosing one that you're really confident in. Like over time, your community might have like 15 extra content features, but that would be really hard to start with off the bat. So when I say showstopper, I'm really just talking about like choosing something you're pretty confident people will open the community for off the bat versus saying, oh, I'm just going to start with a forum and then over time I'll add stuff.
Right, right. I think that makes total sense to me now. And it's something that we've talked about a bit, I think, throughout this program is how do you sort of get people to want to opt in? And sometimes it's because it's, I think it was Steph Smith in her session, she said, you know, sometimes it's hard for people to imagine what value they're going to get from the community. And it's a little bit vague to them until they get in there and then they find out there's all this value to connect. So that showstopper, it sounds like, is really about getting somebody over the hump of, okay, sure, I'll create the account. I'll check this out. You know, maybe I don't really know if I want to engage or whatever. And then suddenly it's, you know, they're in and then they see all this extra value. So it's a more clear way to have somebody to join. So I think that
Yeah.
makes sense to me as well.
And I should also say all these added content features, they're more than just a way to like lure people into the community. They are that,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. But it's also a way to set the tone for the type of content that you think is valuable. It's like your way of demonstrating what do we talk about here or what are the things that this community values. And that's kind of the way that you start to shift the tone away from places where people only will come in and ask questions or like ask for help versus places where people are willing to share expertise.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I think that makes a ton of sense. So, you know, something else I wanted to ask about is at Teachable, you have a really great view into how teachers, people who are creating content, educational content, of really every different, I mean, there's so many different types of teachers on the platform. You have a pretty good view, I think, of how they're extending their classroom or their, course into a community. So yeah, I'd be curious if you wanted to chat for a minute about how that transition kind of happens. Maybe somebody has a course or they have content they're going to create and they want to build a community around that. Yeah, what does that typically look like from a process standpoint?
Yeah. So what I see the most is people that already have a following or already have people that are bought into their content, starting a community based off of student demand. So they seem to say that their students are asking for a community all the time because a lot of the courses that people teach tend to be like super niche. So, for example, there's a woman that we always love to talk about on Teachable who has a course on iron deficiency in goats. So, like
Wow.
things that are incredibly niche, where if you found someone who's teaching about that thing, you'd be like, oh my God, I found my person, and this person is interested in this bizarre thing that I like. And theoretically, there's all these other people who like it too, and I want to find them. Um, so I think that's how it comes out as well. Um, and then I also see people doing it as a way to keep all of like the commentary around their courses in one place, like versus having, say they have like 15 courses, and versus having people comment on different lectures in those courses, having everybody in one place to discuss the content together, and having like more advanced students talking to less advanced students and the like.
Yeah, and that's probably part of how you choose platform as well, is that, you've got certain goals, and if it's about commenting on the content and stuff, that might be a different platform. I know obviously you all use Circle. If anyone else had any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat. Yeah, there we go. We can jump into the other view. I have a question here from Jackson Reed. Great presentation. What advice would you give folks interviewing for community manager positions? Any questions to ask or red flags to identify companies in it for the wrong reasons? So maybe they're even trying to understand, if I'm a community manager and I want to join this company as the community manager, what are the red flags that I should look for? And any other advice for interviewing for community manager positions?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jackson. So one thing that I always look out for is um, whether the company has a super clear vision for community already. So a lot of times companies will hire for a community manager, but they don't really know what community is, or they don't have a clear idea of the program that they want to run. So like a really great community manager position would be one where you're filling someone's shoes who already ran the community. And if they don't seem to know like what community really is, and maybe they're saying like, oh, you're going to be managing social media and you're going to be managing our email list and all this kind of stuff. I would just try to get a sense of like what the goals are behind those things and whether they're willing to have you sort of manage up and define the program. Um, I just like to ask, what do you mean by community? Where does your community live? What channels do you think fall under community? And if they say that they expect you to manage like social media and a community platform and an email list, that's probably a job I wouldn't take unless I was like dying to get my feet into those different channels, which I'm not personally. Yeah.
I think a great thing you could maybe take to the interview as well is the 5-step. I forget the exact words. The 5-step sort of program or template that she outlined. I feel like that'd be a great thing to almost bring to the interview, in the sense that if they say, how would you get started, or what do you think you would do to build out the community for our company? You could say, well, I have a 5-step template that I run through. I set a goal. I interview people. I set the content cadence. So anyways, that might be a nice hack for somebody as well, to show them that you have you could establish that. But it sounds like part of what you're saying is that it could be a red flag as well if they want you to establish all that. They don't really know what their vision is, et cetera.
Yeah. And it's super common. Like if you start looking for community manager jobs, you'll see a ton that have like really random marketing things in them, which
And
is just comes from the fact that people say community about like their whole audience. So what all they're really saying is like, we're looking for someone to come in and like work with our audience in a lot of different ways. So maybe also just ask Jackson, like, what's a community program that you admire to the company? Like, what are they modeling it off of?
yeah, super good question, though. I think that actually kind of shines a light on some interesting aspects of this community space. One of them being, and feel free if anyone else has questions, happy to take them, but I'll kind of continue forward with the questions I have. So, on the back of that, where is the overlap with social media? Where is the overlap with marketing? And, you know, I guess what is the red flag version of being pulled into that stuff too much? If you find yourself doing this, you're no longer really community managing. But where are the parts where you actually do want to integrate there? And maybe you could even speak to how you've integrated into Teachable's marketing.
Yeah, for sure. So I collaborate really closely with our social media manager and our editorial team and also email marketing. Um, and it kind of, one of the biggest ways is like from content sourcing. So like I spoke a little bit about this, but for social media, that's just like a hungry beast that needs like constant content. I'm in awe of what my colleague Kaylee does with social media. And a lot of times, one of the content buckets that she likes to feature is creators and what they're doing, what they're working on, what they think. And so a lot of what I do with her is sourcing creators that are really interesting to feature on social media and making those types of connections. And ditto with our editorial. So we source a lot of like blog post type of stuff from people that we find in the community. And through email, it's just a matter of kind of community is a feature of Teachable. So it's something that we may insert into different types of pitches or that we might reference in our newsletter. There's all sorts of different ways that it comes in. But I think generally those contributors would probably agree. They have their own expertise with email marketing and social media. And they're not channels that, except for really early stage startup, generally one person would manage.
Yeah, so you could kind of talk to, if you're interviewing or whatever, if you're working in your company or looking to hire, it's like the community manager would say something like, of course, I would integrate with all of those people. I would work with social media. I'd work with the newsletter to help with content ideas or just sharing what's new. But really, they should sort of be separate in terms of their thinking. I think there's another point that I really wanted to spend another minute on that I found to be really interesting and is a little bit of a recurring theme, which is, and I think this could be in the goal setting question maybe or in that outline, is this aspect of like, why should somebody enter the community, but then also why should they come back? And I think there's something really to understanding what is the thing that's going to drive someone to remember to return. And you even made a comment, I think, about like a community that was related to maybe ice skating or something. And it's like at some point in someone's life, maybe it's that they ice skate every Sunday, or maybe that it's cold out now. It feels like there's some type of reminder, oh yeah, that's the community thing I want to go do. And I guess I wonder if you have any other thoughts on developing that aspect, because it just feels like it's kind of critical. Like if people don't have some type of reminder or they don't have some thought, it's time for me to jump back in. That's kind of why you see communities, turn into dead zones, I guess.
Yeah, which is such a kind of common and frightening thing to happen. Yeah, I think it's really all about habit setting. And some of the habit setting comes from your content strategy. So, like I mentioned that I do these like weekly recurring anticipated prompts in my community where I ask people to share what their goals are for the week. I don't even have to ask them to do that at this point. Like a lot of times people kick it off by themselves. So they'll they know it's Monday, I'm going to go and share my goals in the Teachable community. So if they kind of link up to a ritual like that, that's a really good way to keep them reminded, because they'll associate different parts of the week, or like different activities that they do already. But then another thing is like weaving in community touch points into other parts of like your marketing ecosystem. So like in my community, we have some like in-app messaging that drives people to the community. And like I mentioned, putting it into email onboarding sequences. We have a few other kind of like automated email drips that run that remind people to open up the community depending on different kinds of milestones that they might reach with Teachable. And then the last thing is just like being a person. So like personal outreach is something I do a ton of, like emailing people specifically if they said something really insightful in the community and asking them to expand on it, or reaching out to someone that was super active a month ago and just being like, hey, how are things going? So those types of more, that kind of falls into the it doesn't scale category, but those types of things are really important.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's a lot about experimenting and then seeing what's working and then sort of formalizing them. So it's like trying something out, seeing that it's actually creating an experience that people like, and then how do I formalize this? And some of that can be, as you said, reaching out to members who are doing that naturally. So maybe it's your member or a member who comes up with an idea. Maybe they're the first person to say, "Hey, what if we all shared our goals this week?" And maybe encouraging them or something, putting a framework around that to help that recur. But that's definitely something I've been thinking about more too, is how do you encourage those best participants? How do you, if you see someone doing something great, how do you make sure that they feel like that was worth it, and that, that behavior is rewarded, I suppose.
Totally. Yeah. And I hear people talking about the like intrinsic and extrinsic reward structure. So like, you know, a piece of swag versus like a high five, or just like you did great, and kind of varying those things. So obviously, like when I see people that are just being amazing in the community, I will say something and be like, thank you for responding to this, or like, this is so insightful. I also do a like a weekly digest at the end of the week in my communities, and I'll kind of curate, these are the best topics of the week. I'll give some shout outs to people. So those are kind of like the high fives. But then the kind of more tangible things, like I give out swag, like I will send people stuff in the mail, and also giving people more like codified ways to share content is really great too. So if you can help link someone up to like being featured on a blog post, that tends to be something people really like.
When do you promote somebody beyond general community member into admin, or into, are you ever pulling people out from that group and actually setting some new status, or, I don't know exactly what to call it, but role?
Mostly I do it with just like user generated content. So like having people give presentations within the
Oh,
community.
fascinating. Okay, yeah. So you can
Yeah.
elevate status just by purely shining more of a light on them. It doesn't need to be a formal role. Hey, you're the teachable moderator. It's like, why don't you come in and talk to the whole group about that? I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, like something that's more kind of good for them versus just like asking them to do a job for me, I guess.
Yeah, ask them to do more. Right.
Yeah.
Totally. Got just a few minutes left here. So if anybody has any questions, recommend you do that now. We have linked you up to two different very interesting resources. The first being that ComSore post that apparently changes every day because of how many new tools there are entering the community market, which I think is good news for everybody here. More ways to sort of get support as you build out your communities. That second link, which is the bit.ly link, which I didn't include as an www, so I'm going to actually copy paste and repost that. If you're somebody who's applying for a community manager job and you want to show them that you have a very clear understanding of how to roll out a community, I recommend you use that. Or if you're just working yourself, I think to me the goal aspect is like a really clear takeaway for everyone here. Oops, sorry, I didn't do the Bitly. I did the MailChimp, so
Totally
we
fine.
won't see the clicks, but that's all right. But yeah, I think that's a great resource for people as well. And yeah, if there's no other questions, I guess last 30 seconds here. But do you want to share anything else about where people can find you, how they can engage? I feel like in this nice intimate setting, we can all kind of continue the conversation, elsewhere, whether it's Twitter or whatever.
Totally. Yeah, I'm on Twitter. I am, you can shoot me an email, first name, last name at Gmail. I blog about this kind of stuff, and just like
Right.
generally anywhere that you find me, you're welcome to reach out, LinkedIn, whatever. And I would also say, yeah, any last questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I run webinars in our Teachable community, and oftentimes people are like holding on to it till the last second. They're like typing it out, and like last second I sent it in. So feel free to pop it in.
I do that at big conferences. I'm like, I have a question, but I'm going to let a few other people ask. And then right at the end, it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, if you're yeah, nervous to ask. Okay, great. We actually just got one. What are you excited about with community these days? Like what's most exciting to you that you sort of see next?
This is by far the most exciting year for community, like bar none. I think that even just like a few years ago, the idea of like what community was and what the value was super nebulous. And it's really exciting that you have to jump through a lot fewer hoops now in 2020 to like sell people on the idea of community. So if you're someone that's like, I'm a real like true believer in community, you will be able to convince people very easily that it is a valuable use of time. And there are a lot of really good case studies of companies that are using it effectively. So less kind of barrier to entry.
Yeah, amazing. Just the rise of sort of the community manager as this, more formal position, the importance, and really, yeah, it just feels like it is such a core piece of sort of business moving forward. So I think everybody here, you're in the right spot. You are, I think, still early on this in general. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you so much for your time and for your insight. It's
My
always,
pleasure.
yeah, always great to chat with you. And yeah, I just encourage everybody to reach out online if they want to connect with Noelle more. And otherwise, I'll catch you elsewhere in different communities around Twitter.
Yeah, for sure. Nice to see you. Take care.
Yeah, and both Matt and Tessa say thank you. Awesome session, really helpful, really
Thank you so
insightful.
much.
So yes, and thank you all for attending. We will see you again for the next session. Have a good rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are.
Yeah, take care.
All right, thanks
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye.